Okay, so we'll pick up here at the medulla oblongata. This is still part one of the brain, nervous system. The figure here just demonstrates to you the structures there of the brain. These are the major components of the medulla oblongata. Now, I'm sure you're not going to be tested on each of these particular regions or each of these particular nuclei, but you should appreciate where the cranial nerves are coming off along the medulla there. And you see they're labeled by Roman numeral there, starting at Roman numeral number 2, number 3, work your way down. Important for you to recognize that, especially when I talk about uncal herniation. Remember we talked about the venous blood flow. If a blood vessel ruptures and blood leaks under the dura mater and presses down on the brain and forces the brain down. This is the brain stem, the medulla oblongata, and you can see the nerves that would be affected when uncal herniation occurs. If you look at the location of cranial nerve number 3, you can see why one of the signs and symptoms we look for clinically when a person has a brain injury is a pupil becoming grossly dilated. That's controlled by the oculomotor nerve number 3. And so if the brain is being pushed down, pushed through the foramen magnum, one of the nerves that gets compressed in that process is the oculomotor nerve. And when that nerve gets compressed, the pupil will dilate. And so typically when the brain is being pushed down, it doesn't push down symmetrically. Both sides don't push down at the same time. Brain usually will shift a little bit to the left or to the right, then it'll begin to be pushed down. And so you may see the left pupil dilate first. And so you may have heard on ER before they say left pupil's blown. Well, it means the uncal herniation is compressing on that left oculomotor nerve, and then when both pupils are blown, that means now there's so much pressure pushing down on the brain that both of those nerves are getting compressed. That's not a good sign. That's not a good sign. Everything you do in the emergency room in a head injury up until that point is to alleviate the increased intracranial pressure. We'll talk about increased intracranial pressure today if we have time. So normal intracranial pressure is about 10. With increased intracranial pressure, anything above 10, and if you see those nerves, that indications of the nerve being compressed as you would in an uncal herniation, or the pupil being blown or grossly dilated, is indicative of increased intracranial pressure causing compression on oculomotor 3. So this is the brainstem. So also cranial nerve 3, 4, 5, what do they innervate? Time's up, diaphragm. 3, 4, 5 keep the diaphragm alive. So cranial nerve 3, 4, and 5 affect diaphragm alive. 3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. So cranial nerve 3, 4, and 5, and you see them lined up right there together. So in uncal herniation, the brain's being pushed down. If the cranial nerve number 3 is getting compressed, you can bet cranial nerve number 4 and 5, and so the person's going to begin to have respiratory distress as well, because the diaphragm controls 80% of your respiration. And so in head injuries, almost always you'll see a change in the pattern of the breathing. The person's breathing will become irregular. There are various descriptions of breathing. I won't go into detail about it. In the respiratory system stuff we talked about, Kussmaul respirations and Cheyne-Stokes, all that. But patterns of breathing change when those nerves get compressed. The bottom line, in a head injury that has increased intracranial pressure, the medulla oblongata gets affected, and you see compression of those various areas. So the figure includes the majority of the cranial nerves there, 11. 2 through 12 are posted there. Gives you some appreciation for where the nerves come off. Roman numerals are used to designate the cranial nerves. This is another view identifying the pons. Medulla oblongata is a very busy place for communication between the brain and spinal cord. Involves tracts that ascend and descend, taking information to peripheral structures, receiving information back from those same structures. Again, you can see the arrangement of the cranial nerves as they come off there. Another view looking at the inferior portion of the medulla oblongata as it resembles the spinal cord. Again, that's where that blend will take place from the lower portion, the inferior portion of medulla oblongata, as it blends into the spinal cord. The gray matter, white matter organization is a little more complex, and we'll touch upon that a little bit in some of the other lectures that's a part of this series. As one ascends the medulla, you'll see the central canal that opens up into the fourth ventricle. That's where some of the cerebral spinal fluid would be located at. Now, oops, did I skip? Sorry, yeah. Now, three major groups of nuclei that are there. There's the autonomic nuclei, which control visceral activities like the gut, the GI activity. Sensory and motor nuclei of the cranial nerves that give instructions. Remember, the cranial nerves primarily are going to affect the facial features, facial muscles of facial expression, muscles of mastication, auditory muscles, visual muscles mainly. Cranial nerves come directly off the tissue of the brain versus spinal nerves, which come off the spinal cord. So most of the nuclei of the cranial nerves located in the medulla oblongata. And then there are some relay stations there also in the medulla that are involved in the sensory and motor pathway. We'll just touch upon some of those briefly. Autonomic nuclei, reticular formation, loosely organized mass of gray matter, contains embedded nuclei. These reticular formation in the nuclei oblongata have centers responsible for the regulation of autonomic function. Autonomic function are those functions in our body that take place. We don't have to consciously think about them taking place. Our heart beating, the digestion of food when we eat food, all of these are carried out by the autonomic nervous systems. We'll talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. These are autonomic functions. Nuclei there in the medulla control that. Reflex centers received input from cranial nerves, cerebral cortex, and the brainstem. Their output controls or adjust activity in one or more peripheral systems. The autonomic nuclei controls visceral activities, two major groups. There are reflex centers, and then there's also the cardiovascular center, and then there is the respiratory rhythmicity center. Two major groups of reflexes, and your book there, whatever you got the name for it is, the book it talks about reflexes to a degree. Some of the reflex centers, just touch upon the cardiac reflex center, the cardiovascular center, adjusts heart rate, the strength of cardiac contraction, the flow of blood through peripheral tissue. In terms of function, cardiovascular system is subdivided into cardiac and vasomotor center, but the anatomical boundaries are a bit difficult to determine, which is how it's separated. The respiratory rhythmicity center set the basic pace for respiratory movement, activity regulated by inputs from the apneustic and the pneumotactic center of the pons. Medulla oblongata contains sensory nerves and motor nerves. I don't think I remember any questions about sensory or motor nerve. I don't think I remember any questions about being able to tell me which one is sensory, which one's motor. I don't think I remember seeing that on the exam, but not that that's not important information, but I don't think you'd be asked to differentiate the two. The medulla oblongata contains sensory and motor nuclei. Now you should know the nuclei there in the medulla do have sensory and motor components. Associated with 5 cranial nerves, these are the ones that have sensory and motor. 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Cranial nerves that provide motor command to muscles of the pharynx, neck, back, as well as the visceral organs of the thoracic and peritoneal cavity. Cranial nerve number 8 carries sensory information from receptors in the inner ear to the vestibular and cochlear nuclei, which extend from the pons in the medulla. So cranial nerve number 8 carries the auditory information. Relay stations along the sensory motor pathway. There's a nucleus gracilis, and also nucleus cuneatus that pass somatic information to and from the thalamus. There are tracks, multiple tracks that lead from these nuclei going to various destinations, some in the brain, some outside the brain. There's a crossing over that's referred to as ducusation. I'm not going to ask you about that. I didn't see that on in the exam. Solitary nucleus on either side of the visceral sensory information reaches the CNS from spinal nerves and from cranial nerves. Information is integrated and forwarded through other autonomic centers of the medulla oblongata to elsewhere. There are multiple nuclei, and I just referenced a few of them throughout here. I wouldn't expect you to learn about each of these nuclei. That's not going to be what's going to be covered on the exam. The pons, you should be familiar with the pons. It links the cerebellum with the mesencephalon, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum of the spinal cord. The pons contain 4 groups of components: sensory motor nuclei of the cranial nerves, nuclei involved in control of respiration, nuclei in tracts that process and relay information heading to and from the cerebellum, and then ascending, descending, and transverse tracts. These are 4 groups of components that are part of the pons. Cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 innervate the jaw muscles, the anterior surface of the face. 1 is an extraocular muscle, the lateral rectus muscle, and then the sense organs of the inner ear, the vestibular and the cochlear nuclei. Sensory and motor nuclei of cranial nerves involved in the pons. Pons also contains 4 groups of components. On each side of the pons there are reticular formation. This region contains 2 respiratory centers, apneustic center and pneumotaxic center. And if you remember, what helps you to kind of remember this, because you're probably not going to remember specifically what nerves each where, but just think about that process of uncal herniation that I talked about. When the brainstem pushes down, you know the pupils are going to dilate, so that's got to be in that area of the medulla around the pons. You also know that respiration is going to be affected now, so 3, 4, 5 keep the diaphragm alive. So respiratory center makes sense when we talk about the pons, when we look at the 4 major components. Okay, when we talk about centers that modify activity from respiratory and rhythmicity center in the medulla oblongata. Nuclei and tracts process relay information heading to and from the cerebellum. The pons link the cerebellum with the brain stem. Now remember, the cerebellum is more in charge of balance and motor control. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the future as well. Oh, okay. Thank you. The pons has 4 groups of components: longitudinal tracts that interconnect with portions of the CNS, the middle cerebral peduncles connected with the transverse fibers which cross the anterior surface of the pons. These fibers and axons that link the nuclei of the pons, the pontine nuclei, with the cerebellar hemisphere on opposite sides. This is the cerebellum. Picture of that. You remember that from anatomy. Posterior superior surface of the cerebellum showing the major anatomical landmarks of the region. The center divide is referred to as the vermis. It's anterior lobe, primary fissure, posterior lobe. You see its location in the illustration that's in the upper left-hand corner, demonstrating to you the cerebellum sits inferior to and posterior, inferior posterior location at the brain. This is a cross-sectional view of the cerebellum showing the arrangement of the gray matter, some of the nuclei that are located there, and again the relationship between the cerebellum, where it sits at in relationship to the brain. As you can see, it's directly posterior to the pons. You may or may not be able to read that, but it won't come out on your printout anyway. But gray matter, cerebral cortex, and the cerebellum nuclei are located in the nuclei region there, responsible for involuntary coordination, control of ongoing body movement, and then the white matter is responsible for connecting cerebellar cortex to the nuclei with the cerebellar peduncles, links the cerebellum with the different parts, 3 different parts: the mesencephalon, diencephalon, cerebrum, contains transverse fibers that carry communication between the cerebellum and the pons. Then it links the cerebellum and the medulla in the spinal cord, and then it interconnects some of the nuclei, the pontine nuclei specifically, with cerebellar hemisphere on opposite sides. This allows us to maintain coordination and balance in our body. Cerebellum also has 2 primary functions. That's adjusting the postural muscles of the body and programming fine-tuning movements that control conscious and subconscious levels. I'm sure you're going to get a question about the cerebellum and what it does. So motor control, motor function, adjusting postural muscles, and programming and fine-tuning movements. Cerebellum coordinates rapid automatic adjustments to maintain balance and equilibrium. These alterations in muscle tone and positions are made by modifying the activities of the motor center in the brainstem. Cerebellum refines learned movement patterns. This function is performed directly by relating activities along the motor pathway and the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, the motor centers, and the brainstem. Cerebellum compares the motor commands with proprioceptive information, position sense. Proprioceptive information, you should be familiar with that term, proprioception, proprioceptive information, position sense, and performs adjustments, any adjustment made to make movement smooth. If you go to fall off balance, it's the cerebellum that gets you back on track. If you have trouble with balance, or if you have trouble with any type of motor coordination, it's typically the cerebellum that's been compromised in that disease process. Very complex, convoluted surface composed of neural cortex, the fovea, which is just a region of that area, folds in the cerebellum, makes it look kind of like a little cauliflower on the edges. Less prominent than the folds of the surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Anterior, posterior lobes are separated by a primary fissure, which I showed you before, referred to as the vermis. Along the midlines, a narrow band of the cortex known as the vermis separates the cerebellar hemispheres. Anatomically, you should be familiar with that. And then the slender flocculo-nodular lobe, which lies between the root of the fourth ventricle and the cerebellar hemisphere. The cerebrum and the I guess similar to the cerebrum, the cerebellum has a superficial layer of neural cortex, extensive dendrite and Purkinje cells that receive input from over 200,000 synapses. So it's a very busy area in the brain. Internally, there's white matter, gray matter. Internally, it's white matter of the cerebrum. It forms branching array of sectional areas, and you can see that, or we're able to see that on that previous slide that showed the sectional view of the cerebellum. Anatomists have called this basically the tree of life. Cerebellum receives proprioceptive information we already talked about. Most of the axons carry sensory information, do not synapse in the cerebellar nuclei. It passes through deeper layers of the cerebellum on the way to other cells in the nervous system, Purkinje cells specifically. Information about motor commands issued by conscious and subconscious levels reaches the Purkinje cells indirectly after being relayed through nuclei. And that's in the nervous system. That's basically how communication takes place. There are tracks that take information away from the brain, tracks that bring information back, take away, take back. And then there are nuclei, kind of like the control centers of these particular nerve tracks that information will have to enter through and then get directed to the appropriate area of integration where that information received in has to be integrated in a particular area. A nerve track helps you to be able to visualize an object, but then that track has to bring information back to through the optic nerve, and then there's a region in our brain that integrates that information that's being seen so we can perceive it in our conscious thought. If we don't integrate appropriately, and that's discussed later on in the lecture, if you don't integrate appropriately, if something's wrong with this nerve track, if something's wrong with the integration center, then the eyes anatomically can be there. Anatomically, the nerves that go into the eye can be there. But if you cannot interpret the information correctly in the integration system, then it won't work. Another example of that is, and I'll stick with the eye, is a child that gets born with an eye that's turned medially, or if you get born with an eye that's turned laterally. If you don't have that corrected while the child is still very young, then even if you get it corrected as an adult, the child can never use that eye, because the eye has to learn where the integration system is in the brain. So you have a normally appearing eye, but it doesn't function because it never learned to integrate the information inside the brain. So it's a complex process, the brain. And this just talks about the tracks a little bit more. You can read that, but that's basically what I just went over. The peduncles are just another area in the brain that also connect the hemispheres. You know, one hemisphere has to know what the other hemisphere is doing, sensory and motor information, so there is some interconnections there that information is exchanged. The inferior cerebellar peduncle permits communication between the cerebellum, the nuclei in the medulla oblongata, and carries ascending and descending cerebellum tracts through the spinal cord. Tracts, nuclei, again, these are just the areas of communication. And I emphasize that to you just so you remember, in the nervous system, yes, it's important to be able to sense information in the environment, but then also you have to be able to send signals to structures outside of the nervous system as well. Cerebellum damage. The cerebellum can be permanently damaged by trauma, stroke, temporarily affected by things such as drug and alcohol. Drink a little bit, your balance gets off because it's affecting the cerebellum. Or you may have to drink a lot bit and it affects your cerebellum, whatever the case may be. The result is a condition referred to as ataxia. This is basically a disturbance in balance. You should be familiar with the term ataxia. You should be familiar that it relates specifically with the cerebellum. In severe ataxia, individuals cannot sit or stand without assistance. Now, these other parts of the brain, and I believe I saw one question about, I think it was diencephalon. So we'll go through each one of these cephalons just so you kind of appreciate what they mean. The mesencephalon, external anatomy of the mesencephalon, or the midbrain and the major nuclei. This is just a gross picture of where it's located at in the body. External anatomy of the mesencephalon, or the midbrain. Mesencephalon, or the tectum, or the roof of the mesencephalon, contains two pairs of sensory nuclei. Corpora quadrinum, I don't think they're going to see that on the exam. These nuclei, superior and inferior colliculi, process visual and auditory information. The mesencephalon has a portion of it referred to as colliculus. Superior colliculus receives visual information from specific nuclei. The inferior colliculus also receives auditory data. Some of the information may be forwarded to the medial geniculate on the same side. And basically, what all these nuclei, even the colliculi, are referring to is just the integration of information that's being received in through the system. Mesencephalon, on each side of the mesencephalon, you see the red nucleus and the substantia nigra. Red nucleus contains a number of blood vessels, which gives us a rich blood supply and thus its name. Nucleus receives information from the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Issues of subconsciousness, motor command that affect upper limbs, position, and background muscle tone. The substantia nigra is a nucleus that lies lateral to the red nucleus. The gray matter in this region contains a darkly pigmented cell. That's what gives it its color, the black color, and thus the name substantia nigra. Nerve fibers and bundles in the ventrolateral surface of the mesencephalon and the cerebral peduncle contain descending fibers that go to the cerebellum by way of the pons, and descending fibers that carry voluntary motor commands issued by the cerebral hemisphere. Again, when we talk about maintaining communication, it's these descending fibers that send information back down to voluntary muscles to carry out specific commands or functions. Mesencephalon also contains the headquarters of the reticular activating system. Should be familiar with this system. Specialized component of the reticular formation. Stimulation of the mesencephalon portion of the reticular activating system makes us more alert and more attentive. The gross picture of the structures. Then the diencephalon plays a vital role in integrating conscious and unconscious sensory information and motor commands. Consists of an epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. This is just a color-coded view that would demonstrate you where these major groups would: medial group, lateral group, anterior group, posterior group, ventral group. Epithalamus is at the roof of the diencephalon. Won't go into much detail about the epithalamus at all. The main thing is melatonin is a hormone that we see here. The posterior portion of the epithalamus contains the pineal gland, which is an endocrine structure that secretes the hormone melanin. That's important to know. I would know that. Melatonin is important in the regulations of day-night cycle, also in the regulation of reproductive function. Most neural tissue in the diencephalon is concentrated in two thalami, which form the lateral walls, in the hypothalamus, which forms the floor. The ascending sensory information from the spinal cord and cranial nerves, other than olfactory tracts, will synapse in the nuclei of the left and right thalamus. The cerebral cortex and our conscious awareness is there. Now, the hypothalamus is an organ that you should be familiar with in its function. The hypothalamus contains centers involved in emotions and visceral processes that affect the cerebrum, as well as the other components of the brainstem. Also controls a variety of autonomic functions and forms a link between the nervous and the endocrine system. The thalamus is the final relay point that you see. The ascendant sensory fibers, information that will be projected into the primary sensory cortex, acts as a filter, passing only to a small part and arriving at sensory information. The thalamus also coordinates activity at the basal nuclei at the cerebral cortex by relaying information. The left thalamus and the right thalamus are separated by the third ventricle. Each of the thalamus consists of rounded mass of thalamic nuclei. It's just an anatomical description. It's a projection of gray matter called the intermediate mass that extends into the ventricle and the thalamus on each side. About 70% of the human population has two thalami fused at the midline along where fibers cross. The significance of that, I don't know. Functions of the thalamic nuclei. You need to be a little bit familiar with the function here. Primarily to relay sensory information from the basal nuclei to the cerebral cortex. It's a primary function. 5 major groups there: anterior, medial, ventral, posterior, and the lateral groups. And this is what each of the group does, but again, now go back, you see, primarily includes those systems that are involved in emotion and motivation. Anterior group, medial group, integrated sensory information, projects sensory information, integrates sensory information, projects visual information, projects auditory information, integrates sensory information. Bottom line, all of that is sensory information that we see involved in the thalamus. All of the groups that are there are involved in integration of sensory information. That's what I would appreciate from that. I wouldn't go through and try to learn each one of those groups and see specifically what it does, but I would appreciate that they are involved in sensory information. Okay. Anterior group includes the anterior nuclei, which is a part of the limbic system. This system involves emotions, motivation, and this will be discussed in one of I think the lecture that follows this one. The nuclei in the medial group provides a conscious awareness of the emotional state, connecting emotional centers, the hypothalamus, with the frontal lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. The medial group also receives relay sensory information from other portions of the thalamus. The nuclei in the ventral groups relay information from the basal nuclei, the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the somatic motor areas of the cerebral cortex. The ventral group nuclei also relay sensory information about touch, pressure, pain. Again, you see this recurrent theme: sensory information, touch, pressure, pain, temperature, proprioception. Proprioception is position sense to sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. And then the posterior group, also involved in sensory information, the integration of sensory information. Some other structures are located in this posterior group. The pulvinar, just one of them, integrates sensory information involved in projection into the cerebral cortex. It's important. That's the only important thing that you really need to take away from there. Nuclei of the lateral group form feedback loops in the limbic system. Again, we'll talk about that in part 2 of this lecture series. The lateral group affects the emotional states and the integration of sensory information. The hypothalamus extends from an area superior to the optic chiasm, crossover where the optic tracts from the eyes arrive to the brain. to the posterior margin of the mammillary bodies. That's where the eye tracts, the optic nerve tracts, will cross. You probably have seen that in a gross anatomy picture. The mammillary bodies process sensory information, including olfactory sensation, and provides a sense of smell. Also contain motor nuclei that control reflex movements associated with eating, such as chewing, licking, and swallowing. Immediately posterior to the optic chiasm, there is a narrow stalk referred to as the infundibulum. It's a nice thin stroke that comes down. It extends inferiorly, connecting to the floor of the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Now, there are major communications between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Most of the stimulating hormones for the pituitary gland come from the hypothalamus. It's that signal from the hypothalamus that triggers the pituitary gland to secrete the majority of substances that we'll see when we talk about the pituitary gland more. The floor of the hypothalamus between the infundibulum and the mammillary bodies is a tubercle area. Tubercle area contains nuclei that are involved in the control of pituitary function. So what are the functions of the hypothalamus? I would be familiar with these. Hypothalamus center: sensory information from the cerebrum and the brainstem and spinal cord, changes in the composition of cerebrospinal fluid, interstitial fluid, chemical stimuli in circulating blood that move rapidly across highly permeable capillaries and enter into the hypothalamus where there is no blood-brain barrier. These are some of the components of the hypothalamus, and again, I wouldn't ask you to go through and know what each one of those different regions do. Generally, when you look over into function, you see secretion of antidiuretic hormone. You see secretion of oxytocin. You see regulation of body temperature. That's done through a various number of chemical processes. There's feedback mechanisms that control that regulation of body temperature through the chemicals that are being secreted. Release of hormones that control endocrine cells, anterior pituitary gland, control of medullary tract that regulate heart rate and blood pressure through chemical control, and control certain feeding reflexes. So majority of the functions that you see from the hypothalamus are related to the secretion of chemical substances in the body, various hormones and or other chemical substances that regulate certain organ system activity. The lung of the hypothalamus: subconscious control of skeletal muscle contractions. Hypothalamus directs somatic motor patterns associated with rage, pleasure, pain, sexual arousal by stimulating centers other than the portions of the brain. You also see the control of autonomic function, adjusts and coordinates activities of autonomic centers in the pons and the medulla oblongata, and also regulates heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and digestive function. You'll see that more when we talk about the autonomic nervous system as well. Coordination of activities of the nervous system and endocrine system. The hypothalamus coordinates neural and endocrine activities by the production of regulatory hormones. These hormones produce a tubercle area, and it's released, or they are released into local capillaries and transport through the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. In short, that's what the function of the hypothalamus is: subconscious control of skeletal muscle contractions, control of autonomic function, coordination of activities for the nervous and endocrine system. It's the last two that are the major players that we have more we see more direct effect from. Secretion of hormones, again, I already talked about that. Regulation of body temperature, again, we already talked about where that's located at. You see in this response, though, you see some of the chemical mechanisms in controlling temperature may be to increase the heart rate just to get warmer blood circulating around. May require shivering or sending a signal to a chemical signal to nerves to increase the heat production of the body. So various types of responses can be seen here. The other function of the hypothalamus is the control of circadian rhythm. You've probably heard the term circadian rhythm before. Suprachiasmatic nucleus that coordinates daily cycle of activity linked to day-night cycle. That's probably good for Trivial Pursuit to know. The limbic system. The limbic system includes the nuclear tract along the border between the cerebrum and the diencephalon. System is a functional grouping rather than an anatomical one. Functions of the limbic system, functions you should be somewhat familiar with. Establishing an emotional state, linking conscious intellectual function of the cerebral cortex with unconscious and autonomic functions of the brain, facilitating memory of storage and retrieval. It's a lot. We see the sensory cortex, motor cortex, and association areas of the cerebral cortex enable us to provide complex tasks. Remember what I told you about association centers. Anatomically, my eyes can be here. Anatomically, things are working so I can actually get an image of that door. But when it comes to associating that information in the occipital region of my brain, I may have a problem. And so then I cannot communicate with everybody in this type of setting. So the limbic system is an important player in this role. And so the limbic system also is known as the motivational center because it also affects the activity of individuals. This is an anatomical view and diagram of the limbic system, cut in sagittal view. Three-dimensional construction of this limbic system shows the relationship. Major components of the limbic system. The amygdaloid, the amygdala, which is like a little almond, you may have heard that term before, acts as an interface between the limbic system and the cerebrum, plays a role in regulation of heart rate, control of the fight or flight response. Control of the fight or flight response. You probably heard that before when we talked about endocrine, or we talked about the adrenal glands, secretion of epinephrine, which control the flight or fight response. Some components of the limbic system. Gyri, I didn't see anything on the exam that indicated they may ask this, but so 3 gyri are there, just anatomical components of the limbic system. Concealed in the hippocampus. Earlier Adamus had a name for it. They called it a hippocampus because it looked like a seahorse, so I guess that's where the name hippopotamus was derived from. The fornix, which is the third track of the white matter, connects the hippocampus with the hypothalamus. Hippocampus and the fornix serve or curve medially, meeting the counterpart in the opposing hemisphere.